in the real world.
Alright, good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion House, New Mexico, working on oil painting imposed ignorance. Idlon, calm down. I'm going to have to let my cat out before I start. She's about to go crackers. But, yeah, I'm just going to apply some general color to this today, start carving out the basic tones across the board. I've got some browns mixed up for the desktops, 7 flesh tones mixed up for the 7 different figures, some green for the blackboard, an array of colors for the shirts and clothing, and a bright shiny blue for the little girl's butcher knife. Alright, here we go. Idlon the cat, you're going crazy for me.
Getting properly subsidized and defended by everyone else in any state. And also this risk for someone certainly wouldn't have profits, but I don't want to take risks. If anything goes wrong, you bail me out. Okay. So if third world debt gets out of control, you socialize it. It's not the problem of banks. Just making money. When ASML's black, same thing. Public bails them out. When American investment firms get into trouble because the Mexican bubble bursts, you bail out Goldman Sachs, and the Mexico bailout, and on and on. I mean, there's case after case of this. In fact, of the top 100 leading transnationals in the Fortune list of transnationals, there was a recent study of how they related to the states in which they're all somewhere, so they're all mostly here in some national state. Turns out that all 100 of them had benefited from industrial policies, meaning state intervention in their behalf. All 100 had benefited from the state in which they're based, and 20 of the 100 had been saved from total disaster, that is collapse, by just state bailout. When people talk about globalization of the economy, remember that the nanny state has to be very powerful in order to bail out the rich, and nothing is changing in that regard. 20 out of 100, again, were saved from collapse by this, including a number here. Well, that's really existing free market theory. There are many examples of it quite close to home, so we could start with our own governor, Governor Weld, is described by the Boston Globe as a libertarian with a religious belief in free markets. And then a couple of days later, they reported that through various scams, his administration was able to sharply increase federal subsidies to Massachusetts so that way beyond what they were before, so that he could trade as a fiscal conservative. And that's pretty common. Just a year before, you may recall, if you have long memory, they had to close George's Bank, the richest fishing area in the world, because it was being overfished thanks to a combination of deregulation and subsidies to the fishing industry, which had that odd consequence that you tend to get overfishing. So it looked as if the ground fish were wiped out and they had to close it off. It didn't take long for the religious conservative libertarian fanatic William Weld to take the next jet plane down to Washington, hat in hand, asking for a federal bailout. He wanted the national federal government to declare it a natural disaster. And the reason was, as he explained, with presumably some scientists in tow, that there was some strange kind of predatory fish, which no one had yet found, but they would find it, don't worry. So some kind of predatory fish had come and sort of wiped out all the, the cod and the haddock and all those things. So it was a natural disaster, and therefore the general public had to sort of pay off the results of deregulation and subsidizing the fishing industry. Well, that's the way to be a libertarian with religious fervor. Another one is the leader of the conservative revolution, Newt Gingrich. Nobody's more passionate about the market than he is, particular about his own district, which he calls a Norman Rockwell world of jet planes and fiber optics, as indeed it is, except if you ask where jet planes and fiber optics came from, you discover that the public paid for them and still pays for them. And in fact, he manages to get more federal subsidies for his district than any suburban county in the country outside the federal system. So you can have conservatism flowering among the malls and so on. Or you go back to the Reaganites, who are also very passionate about free markets for everyone else. Meanwhile, they boasted to the American business community correctly, that they had done more, that they instituted more protection than any post-war American administration, in fact, more than all of them combined. They had doubled import restrictions, blocking and helped poured public funds into major industries to enable them to recapitalize, to protect, in fact, reconstruct the steel industry and the automotive industry and semiconductors and so on, which would have disappeared if they'd opened the market. The Thatcherites in England were about the same. Government expenditures relative to GNP stayed pretty constant, although anything that went to the general population collapsed. Meanwhile, the military industry shot up. Arms sales are booming. I think that's all publicly subsidized stuff. Arms sales to nice guys like Saddam Hussein and General Suharto and others. Well, that's really existing free market theory. What are the core policies? Well, the Washington Consensus, which is basically designed for the third world, to make it that way and keep it that way, it's now being applied not just to the third world countries, but to the rich industrial societies, with the United States and Britain in the lead. However, it's with a twist. Since it's being applied at home, this is really existing free market theory that's being applied at home, meaning nuance. So powerful government to protect the rich, and market discipline and tough love for everyone else. And you see that very clearly. Go through the various elements of the Washington Consensus. The first one is about reducing government. Well, that's false. We're not reducing government. We're shifting it around. So social spending is indeed way down since the 1970s when this stuff started. Accelerated after 1980, but starting in the mid-70s. The kind of a benchmark example was AFDC, the main support system. That was cut virtually in half from about 1970 to 1990, with obvious effects on poor families and children and so on. It was part of a general war against women and children that was conducted by the conservatives under the name of family values. It's interesting that they were able to get away with that. It tells you something about the intellectual culture. Well, one part was the reduction of AFDC by roughly half, from about 1970 to about 1990. It's now essentially gone. That's purpose of that, as you know, is so that 7 million, a couple of million, I think 5 or 6 million kids, average 7 years old, can learn responsibility. That's part of tough love. Meanwhile, another part of the government has been very stable and in fact is going up, namely the Pentagon system, which remains at approximately Cold War level. That's higher now than it was in Nixon, although the big enemy has disappeared, which tells you exactly how much, tells a rational person at least, exactly how much they were worried about the Russian threat. Not only does it remain at Cold War level, but it's going up under the initiative of the fiscal conservatives, the Heritage Foundation, which, sort of the right-wing foundation that designs the budget for the Gingrich Army, are calling for an increase in the Pentagon system, as is Gingrich, as indeed was Clinton. So that goes up. And I should say that cutting of social spending is being cut very sharply, very much over public opposition. At the time of the 1994 congressional election, big landslide, over 60% of the public wanted social spending to increase. Okay, went very sharply down. What about Pentagon spending going up? Well, that's this public is 6 to 1 opposed to that, which gives you one aspect of a big picture about what's happening to American democracy, and somewhat of a change, not a huge change. So one part of the system is going up, Pentagon spending. Another part's going down, social spending. And the same is true in other domains. Like, for example, legal aid for the poor is being slashed and virtually destroyed. On the other hand, the security system, the government security system, state and federal, that's going up. So prisons are going way up. The prison population, crime hasn't changed for about 20 years. And incidentally, U.S. crime rates are not off the spectrum, contrary to what a lot of people believe. Crime rates are sort of toward the high end of the industrial world, but not off the spectrum, with one exception, namely murder with guns. But that's a special feature of American society, which does not do with crime rates. Apart from that, crime rates are kind of toward the high end, not going up. The prison population tripled during the Reagan years, is going up even faster now. And I think the reason is another aspect of the third world model, namely the superfluous population. There is a big superfluous population. They don't contribute to wealth protection. Well, we're civilized folks. We're not like the people we fund in Colombia who go out and murder them, so we throw them into jail. And that's going way up even more. And there's also a kind of like a side benefit to this. The putting more and more people in jail, and in fact under harsher and harsher conditions, is a technique of social control for everybody else. I mean, if you're, someday down the road you decide to run a dictatorship and you want to really harm people, it's kind of like Hitler Germany or something. You know that you're going to carry out policies that are going to cause people a lot of harm. You've got to control them somehow. And there aren't many ways to do it. Everyone gets on the same way. So what you do is engender fear and hatred and make them hate the guy who looks a little different or whatever it may be. And then you punish those bad guys because they're really awful, and you punish them really hard and so on, and that makes people more frightened. You can just see that happening right around you. And building up the perception of crime. Crime has what they call in literary theory a subtext. You're supposed to understand criminal has the word black in front of it, just like welfare mother, black, rich black, welfare mother. And criminal means, that black guy is coming after you. So what you want to do is, this has the dual effect of getting rid of the superfluous population, basically unskilled workers, close race class correlation, and also demonizing them, so everybody else is scared and frightened, and they'll be willing to accept what's happening to them too, and not look at where the source is. So that part of the drug war is basically for this. It has nothing to do with drugs, but it has plenty to do with criminalizing an unwanted population and scaring everybody else. And so does the harshening of prison conditions, which is really, the United States is off the map on this, in violation of international conventions, constantly condemned in human rights forums, and getting much worse. The reinstitution of chain gangs was, of course, bitterly condemned, but that's that bad South, Alabama. Well, it's now in Illinois. The state senate of Illinois last week or two ago legislated chain gangs, not for violent criminals, incidentally, for people who are found with drugs or robbed a store or something like that. The Chicago Press pointed out this carries this kind of reminiscent of slavery. But the legislator and the state senator who put it through said that this is just another aspect of what he called tough love. And then he explained that some people work better under humiliation. So it's really good to restore elements of slavery. And again, the subtext is everybody else gets scared. Those guys have to walk around like slaves in chains. We must be in real danger. So therefore we'll accept what's happening to us. That's the logic. So prisons are going up. And that has a lot of side benefits. Apart from just getting rid of the superfluous population, it is a source of cheap labor. So prison labor is going way up. Cheap labor, you don't have to worry about unions, no benefits, they don't get out of line. And that also naturally undercuts wages elsewhere. So it's just like forcing welfare mothers to work. Raising children isn't work, as anybody knows who's had children. So you have to drive them to work, kind of like people who go to Fidelity Investment to figure out scams. But have a deal with the security market if you really want these people to work. But since there's no jobs for them, they're going to work at low-paid or publicly subsidized wages, which will undercut other wages. And the same with prison labor. In fact, the scale of prison construction, which is a kind of Keynesian stimulus to the economy anyway, but its scale has become so enormous that even high-tech industry, the guys who are usually just ripping off the Pentagon system, they're beginning to look at it, figuring out, recognizing that high-tech surveillance devices and so on may be another way to sort of get the transfer of public funds to make sure that the high-tech industry keeps moving. It's not the scale of the Pentagon, but it's going up. Well, that's one aspect of what's called reducing government, modifying government to be more precise. Another aspect of it is what's called devolution, moving governmental power from federal to the state level. And that has a kind of a rationale which you hear all over the place. For example, there was an op-ed a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times by John Cogan of Hoover Institute at Stanford, who's pointed out what he called a philosophical issue that divides the Democrats and the Republicans. So the philosophical issue is that the Democrats believe in big government and entitlement, and the Republicans believe in getting power down closer to the people, to the states, because they're kind of populist types. Well, it takes about maybe 3 seconds thought to realize that moving power down to the states in funding and so on is just moving it away from the people for a perfectly elementary reason. There's a hidden part of the system, the power system, that you're not supposed to know about or think about, and that's private power. And now it takes a big corporation like, say, General Electric or Microsoft to sort of pressure the federal government. But even middle-sized guys have no problems with state governments. They can control them quite easily. And in case anyone was too dull to figure this out for themselves, the same day as Cogan's op-ed in the New York Times, which is a typical one, there was a story in the Wall Street Journal about Massachusetts, which had a headline that read, what Fidelity investment wants, it usually gets. Okay. And then the story went on to say that Fidelity Investment, the biggest investment firm in Massachusetts, wanted even more subsidy and support from the state government that it already gets, and was threatening if it didn't, it would move over the border to Rhode Island, where it just owns the place. So therefore the passionately libertarian governor quickly rearranged, tax subsidies and one thing or another, so that Fidelity got what it wanted. Well, Fidelity couldn't have done that with the federal government. Couldn't have said, you give us even more, we're going to move to Switzerland or something. I mean, other guys can do it maybe, but not Fidelity. Raytheon, which is the biggest manufacturing producer, did the same thing. Raytheon, incidentally, Fidelity is not that Fidelity is poor. They just announced record profits a couple of days ago. Same with Raytheon, just announced record profits, but having big problems. So they wanted even a bigger tax subsidy and direct subsidy and tax write-offs, which just means transfer of taxes from the state of Massachusetts, and they threatened if they didn't get them, they were going to go to Tennessee, so of course they got them. The legislature passed a special law giving what they call defense industry special extra subsidies. Notice that Raytheon is publicly subsidized in the first place. That's where its money comes from. But now it has to be additionally subsidized so that its profits will be even higher than the record profits it just made, same with Fidelity. And that's the kind of game anybody can, even way down to much smaller businesses can play with states. And the consequences of devolution are quite straightforward. It means that any funding that goes to, say, block grants that go to the state, you can be reasonably confident that they'll end up in the deep pockets of rich people, not in the hands of hungry children or poor mothers or anything like that. That's how you get power down to the people. Okay, that's devolution. In fact, quite generally, when you look at it, what's called government cutting is more or less cost transfer. It's almost never reduction. Sometimes it's increase. So let's take take health reform. Reform is a word you always ought to watch out for. Like when Mao started the Cultural Revolution, it wasn't called a reform. Reform is a change that you're supposed to like. Okay. And watch. So as soon as you hear the word reform, you can reach through your wallet and see who's lifting it. Anyhow, there are things called health reforms. And the health reforms are supposed to, cut government costs. Well, they do cut one kind of cost, but of course they raise another kind of cost. There's a very respectable outfit called the National Bipartisan Leadership Council, headed by two ex-presidents, Ford and Carter. And it just did a study of the cost transfer effects of the planned health reforms. it concluded that they would add about $10 billion a year extra costs, but those extra costs will come from wages and higher premiums, okay, which means it's a highly regressive tax on the poor. Highly regressive tax, if it comes from wages and premiums, of course. And that's $10 billion a year. They also estimated that it'll increase the number of uninsured by 15 to 20%. This is by the year 2002, so up to about 54 million by the year 2002. Well, that's a cost, big cost, unmeasurable cost. So you find all the way across the board, and furthermore, it's no big secret. So like the Wall Street Journal had a headline which pointed out that when the reforms were moving through Congress, it said rich gain, poor lose, trade-offs for the middle class, okay? Which is right, that's exactly what the reforms are intended to do. You have to remember, by middle class, they mean the people right below the very rich. So they don't mean the median, they're not talking about people with $30,000 a year income. They mean so what it really means is great for the rich, super rich, trade-offs for the near rich, tough business, tough love for everybody else, which is most everything. When you close public hospitals and that sort of thing, you know exactly who's going to suffer. Well, let's go to take, say, New York, which has a conservative governor and conservative mayor, and they're carrying out very extensive conservative tax cuts because they're fiscal conservative. The tax cuts, the New York Times pointed out in a small item, all benefit business. So by accident, all the tax cuts benefit business. Well, there are also tax increases, which are compensating for the tax cuts, but they don't call them tax increases. What they call them is, the phrase is reduction of subsidies for public transportation and for tuition in public universities. Well, subsidy itself is another interesting word, kind of like reform. It's a subsidy if public funds are used for public purposes. That's called a subsidy. It's not called a subsidy when they go to private wealth. That's reform. So they're cutting down subsidies for public transportation.
All right, so that's some basic colors laid around. I'm going to cut it here and then continue with discoloration and a little bit more.
Shift is cutting taxes for business, for the rich, and increasing taxes for the poor, which are going to compensate for that. And that's called fiscal conservatism and cutting government. Well, so it is across the board. You take, if you think about it, take a close look at the things that are called cutting government, and you'll notice they quite characteristically have this property. The next element of the Washington Consensus is making the tax system more regressive. Okay, we don't talk about that. It's stated openly. The thing that isn't stated openly is the reason. This is supposed to be in order to increase investment and give everyone jobs. But it's a really weird way to do that. I mean, the country is already awash in capital. The people whose taxes are being cut don't know what to do with their money. If you want to increase growth, there's another approach that might be used, stimulate weak demand by progressive taxes. That is, put more money into the hands of people who can spend it. That increases growth. That would increase growth. But that's not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is by cutting financial gains so that you can have more speculation against currencies. So that's the second part, make the tax system more regressive. What about deregulation? Well, same effect. Deregulation is a cost-shifting measure. So, for example, if you deregulate, if you allow industries to, as they've done already, to deposit toxic wastes without cost, because you have deregulation, it increases their profits, but it also increases water and sewage rates, which is a regressive tax on everybody else who's got to pay them. Also, it has further costs. Some of them you can't estimate. For example, the costs in, say, health and quality of life and so on. No way to give numbers to those. And there's also going to be the eventual cost of cleanup, but that's going to be a public cost, remember. Incidentally, a good one, because when you clean up the wastes, that increases the gross national product, and we all like to see that go up. But the public will pay those costs. So what it is just another form of radical cost shifting, increase wealth for the rich and decrease it for everyone else. So it fits the experiment's design. And in general, it's kind of like a short-term profit gain for some, very small some, and a big cost for everyone else. What about deregulating the labor market? Well, same process. Actually, that was done by simply criminal behavior. The best review of this I know was in Business Week. The Reagan administration, as they point out, essentially informed the corporate world that they were not going to enforce the laws. There are laws, much hated laws like the Wagner Act that give you the right to organize, and the Reagan administration simply informed business they weren't going to enforce them. So the number of illegal firings went up by about a factor of 6, and similarly across the board. They also informed business they were not going to enforce the OSHA regulations, health and safety regulations. So the number of days lost to injury and the number of injuries and so on also shot up. And in fact, that was a great way to undermine the unions and the right to organize. A whole pile of policies like that, which was part of deregulating labor markets. Another part of deregulation of labor markets is to make them what's called more flexible, meaning you don't have any security and no guarantees. Number of temporary workers goes way up, no benefits. You never know if you're going to have a job tomorrow. That's really good for the economy. That's good for having jobs. Some of the most profitable corporations, the ones who's way up on the Fortune 500 list and booming, are the ones that what they call sell manpower, like Manpower Incorporated, selling temps, which is terrific for making labor markets flexible. It happens to destroy everybody's life, but that doesn't really matter. Again, the similarity to the third world is very close. Back in the 19th, this is what's called economic health. When this happens, you call it an economic miracle, another technical term. So, for example, Brazil was a terrific economic miracle under the Nazi generals that we installed with great self-adulation back in the 60s. And by 1971, it had become the Latin American darling of the business community. And the president, Renflace, pointed out that the economy is doing fine. It's just that the people aren't. We have a Nobel Prize winner who just won the Nobel Prize last time, Robert Lucas of Chicago. And he was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal and said, "We've been doing great and have been for a long time." And he didn't even bother to add what the Brazilian general did. It's only the people who aren't doing well. What he means by we is the top 5% or maybe top 10%, and that's right. We've been doing great, we're doing fine, the economy's fine. By now, we don't even worry about the fact that the people aren't doing so well, like, I won't bother repeating the statistics, which you know and he knows perfectly well. Okay, that's economic miracles. We're now beginning to get one ourselves. What about privatization? Well, again, the effects of that are obvious. So, say, in the latest economic miracle in Mexico, privatization meant, as usual, handing over public assets to friends of the president or other rich people or international investors at a fraction of the cost. And in fact, in Mexico, the number of billionaires during the economic miracle went up even faster than the percentage of people on the poverty line, as some were doing well and the people didn't happen to be doing so well. In fact, it was a catastrophe for them, even before the collapse. So that's privatization. What about property rights? Increase of property rights. That's very important. In fact, it's a critical aspect of what are called misleadingly the free trade agreements, which actually have strong protectionist elements in them, Uruguay round and NAFTA and so on. And one of them is increase of intellectual property rights. I'll go into the details, but what it amounts to is guaranteeing that major corporations have a monopoly on the technology and knowledge of the future. And they extended those to the various devices so that it's about 50 years before you can interfere with owned property, which comes from public subsidy, usually through research, and then is handed over to some private corporation, and nobody else allowed to touch it. So increasing property rights has a big effect, highly protectionist measure, which is central to the new trade agreements, and has a long lasting effect way down the road in organizing the international economy and who gains and who loses. Last element of the Washington Consensus is reducing trade barriers. And here there's another scam that you ought to keep your eyes on. What's called trade in economics is a very odd notion. So for example, if Ford Motor Company moves parts from Indiana to Illinois for assembly and then moves them back to Indiana, that's not called trade. But if Ford Motor Company takes parts made in Indiana and moves them across the border to Mexico, we can get much cheaper labor and not to worry about pollution and so on. And they get reassembled in Mexico and then sent back to, say, Illinois for value added. That's called exports and imports. It never had anything to do with the Mexican economy, or in fact any economy. It was all internal to the Ford Motor Company, but it's exports and imports. So how big an element is that? Well, about 50% of U.S. trade. So about 50% of what's called U.S. trade is actually internal to individual corporations, meaning controlled by a very visible hand with all sorts of methods around for distortion of markets and robbery and so on and so forth. And fifth is about the same for Japan. And for the world, it's hard to get numbers, but what's estimated for the world is around 40% of trade. Agreements like, say, the Uruguay round, GATT, if that increases what's called trade, what it actually does is increase investor rights. That is, it increases the power of transnational corporations. You have to really look pretty closely to figure out what the effect is on trade in any meaningful sense. For example, it may increase cross-border operations, but decrease trade in a meaningful sense of trade, meaning something that's not under the control of kind of corporate mercantilism. Going on with this, it's perhaps worth noticing that the very concept of capitalism and markets has virtually disappeared. So, for example, if you take the current issue of Foreign Affairs, there's an article by Joseph Nye at the Kennedy School, I think maybe it's the dean of the Kennedy School, who explains that there's a big new weapon in the hands of American diplomats. American diplomacy says diplomacy has a force multiplier. And the reason is because of the attraction of democracy and free market enthusiasms of the United States. Those things have given the U.S. a real force multiplier. And then he spells it out. It comes from Cold War investments in high technology, electronics, aviation, telecommunications, and so on. That's our free market enthusiasms and democracy. Well, where did electronics and aviation and telecommunications come from? Well, from public funds. They didn't have anything to do with the free market. They came from public funds, which were transferred to high technology industry under the conscious guise, deceit of security, and it was conscious. So Truman's first Secretary of the Air Force, back in 1948, pointed out to Congress that the word to use is not subsidy. The word to use is security. And in fact, the whole system was designed that way and stays that way. So that's the tribute to democracy and the free markets. Tribute to democracy and free markets is you rob the public by deceit to enrich the rich. That's free markets and democracy. And it's published without comment. Another article and probably nobody notices, because the concept of capitalism, just like the concept of democracy, is just gone. Nobody knows what it is. Democracy means deceive people into doing what the rich people want, and markets means make sure the public subsidize the rich. Or to take another example, take say the Wall Street Journal. I think the last poll remembers what capitalism is. Well, they had a front lead article a couple of weeks ago on various strategies that states, meaning like states of the union, were using to try to be more business friendly. And they picked two examples, Virginia and Maryland, who are sort of competing to see who can most sponsor entrepreneurial values and be most business friendly and so on. And they said, well, for a while it looked like they had somewhat different strategies. That's what they were describing. Turned that for a while Maryland was doing better, Virginia's doing better now. Virginia's doing better. They're more business friendly, more gung ho about business and so on. All right, you read the article. Turns out it's not Virginia and Maryland. What it is the suburbs of Washington, some of which are in Virginia and the others of which are in Maryland. And what are the two business strategies, entrepreneurial strategies? Well, the suburbs of Washington figured they could rip off the National Institute of Health and others develop biology-based industries. They were looking for biotechnology and so on. They figured that's going to be the big cash cow.
Right.
In Virginia, which is
Well,
more business friendly,
it's still got a long ways to go.
decided that the old cash cow,
But that frames
would
in
probably be the best way to rip off public funds. So they were concentrating on
some general colors and reinforces the figures that were
It turned
there.
out that Virginia was the best
Most of it,
better business
even that I
strategy.
applied last
They
night,
had
still
better
needs to
guess
set up
about which
solidly
public funds go
before I
out.
can continue with any
And
glaze
that's what
work
it means to
or
have
doing the
entrepreneurial
background
attitude.
with the
It's
spider, which will
getting
be
without
changed to
comment.
orange with
This
more
just
detail and such.
continued virtually
And all of it will be amped up detail and refined and sculpted into shape. But for the moment, I think that's okay. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting imposed ignorance. Have a good day, Earth.
It's now sort of hit the public, sort of you can read it in the newspapers. New Yorker.